Good evening. I'm Kathy Campbell from the League of Women Voters of Amherst. Before we begin, I'd like to take a minute to thank the co-sponsors of this event, who are among the groups you've seen on your way in. They are the Town of Amherst, Sustaining Amherst, the Pioneer Valley Electric Auto Association, the Berkshire Environmental Action Team, and the League of Women Voters of Amherst. We hope you'll take time to learn more about their involvement in climate action. This event was organized by Kay Jones of Ashfield. We have several facilitators. I think at the moment they're still out in the lobby, but you'll recognize them because they're dressed in green and black, and they can help you if you need any assistance during the next couple of hours. In particular, they'll collect your written questions for the panel that will follow Dr. Bradley's talk. Just hold your questions. I don't know, were there some index cards on the way in? Yeah, and you can just, I think the facilitators will probably give you another card too if you need one. Just hold your hands up and they'll bring them over. So now I would like to present Stephanie Ciccarello, who's the Sustainability Coordinator for the Town of Amherst, to introduce this evening's speakers. Stephanie?
So our first presenter is no stranger to the Town of Amherst, and in particular the University of Massachusetts. A distinguished professor in the Department of Geosciences and director of the Climate System Research Center at UMass Amherst, he has written or edited more than a dozen books and over 200 articles on climate change. He has been an advisor to various government and international agencies, including the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change. Please give a round of applause to Dr. Ray Bradley.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here, and it's always nice to see so many old friends. So what I decided to do today was talk to try to lighten up the discussion about climate change, because it is a rather depressing topic if you just focus on the science itself. And so I've titled this "The Bad News and the Good News," or some good news about climate change. And I'll try to present both sides. And these two images you'll see later on, you can decide which is the bad news and which is the good news for yourself. So we'll start off with the bad news, and there is a lot of bad news, so I'll try to go through it and explain it and frame where we are today, and then we'll discuss some of the good news. So first of all, let's look at the actual facts. Contrary to what you may hear from a number of cabinet members and congressmen on the right, this is actually the record of global warming, and you can see quite clearly that temperatures are rising and have been rising, and we've reached a series of record-breaking temperatures. This is global average temperature based on literally thousands and thousands and thousands of records from all around the world. And we reference this to this 30-year period in the middle here. So this is what we call the baseline temperature. But we could use any baseline and it would look exactly the same in terms of the overall change. So the black dots here are the individual years. The red dot is a sort of a smooth version of that. And for those of you who are less than 40 years old in this room, half of all the carbon dioxide that has been produced by burning of fossil fuel has entered the atmosphere since you were born, which is a pretty astounding fact. So the rate at which carbon dioxide has been accumulating in the atmosphere has accelerated dramatically in the last few decades, bearing in mind that this really began at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the end of the 1700s. So it's taken off, and no surprise, perhaps, that the temperatures have followed that, as we'll see in a minute. Now that's the global average, but if we look at the map of global temperature, and this is the 3 warmest years, which, as I said, are 3 of the most recent years, you can see that everywhere on the Earth, all the yellow and red colors represent temperatures that are above the long-term average. So everywhere is warming, and you can see clearly that things are warming more as we go up to higher and higher latitudes. And in fact, the polar regions are warming 2 to 3 times the average of the globe. And we call this Arctic amplification. And I'll explain why that is in a second, and you'll see for yourself. Now, we also know that the oceans themselves are warming, and what's happening in the oceans is that the heat that is accumulating in the atmosphere is slowly penetrating down into the surface of the ocean, and this represents how much heat is accumulated in the upper 2,000 meters of the ocean surface. So the oceans are getting warmer, and even if we were to stop the production of greenhouse gases tomorrow, that heat would slowly leak out of the atmosphere. And so basically we have a long-term process that will continue long after we eliminate the production of greenhouse gases, if we can do that. Furthermore, as that heat accumulates and the oceans warm, the volume of water expands, and that contributes to sea level rise, as we'll see shortly. Now, as for the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we've been measuring that since 1957, which was the first International Geophysical Year, and this is the baseline location where these measurements are made. It's in the summit of Mauna Loa in the island of Hawaii. It's high up. It's measuring the background level. It's nothing to do with urban pollution or any other industrial pollution. It's measuring the background levels in a very remote part of the planet. And when we look at the measurements that have been made there since 1957, what we see is a steady rise in carbon dioxide. But if we look closely, and I've just expanded this little part of the graph here, and you can see that there's a cycle that goes up and down. And what this represents is the annual cycle of the biosphere. So at this time of year, all the plants in the northern hemisphere, or the deciduous plants, leaf up, and they draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They consume that carbon dioxide, and they create biomass, leaves and wood and so on. And that results in the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere going down. Then in the fall, when those leaves are released back to the atmosphere, they oxidize, and that CO2 goes back, and the level goes back up. And so what we see here is a cycle, an annual cycle. It's the breathing of the planet on a seasonal basis. And you can see clearly that that has been going on every year for the last part of this record. But in addition to that, we have this underlying rise in carbon dioxide on top of that breathing of the biosphere. And that black line is the increase in carbon dioxide from the production of fossil fuel, from the burning of fossil fuel. So what we're doing here, this process of the biosphere breathing has been going on for hundreds of millions of years. And indeed, it happened during the period when, hundreds of millions of years ago, when plants were breathing and they were taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that plant material eventually was transformed by geological processes into what we now think of as fossil fuel: coal, oil, natural gas, and so on. So we're burning that material and we're putting back into the atmosphere the carbon dioxide that was removed hundreds of millions of years ago. And we're doing it at a very, very fast rate, much, much faster than the rate at which that carbon dioxide was taken out of the atmosphere. So what we're seeing here is the normal process of seasonal changes and then the effect of burning fossil fuels superimposed on that. And it really doesn't matter where you are on the planet. You can go to the middle of the Pacific, as we saw in the middle of the record from Hawaii, or we can go to the North Pole or even to the South Pole, and you will still see that seasonal cycle. And even at the South Pole, you see it, but it's very muted. But on top of that, we have this underlying trend. In other words, wherever you are on the planet, we're seeing the effects of this burning of fossil fuel, because the gases mix very quickly. The whole atmosphere is affected, the whole planet is affected by the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it does accumulate. It takes literally centuries for carbon dioxide to be removed from the atmosphere, because the processes by which carbon dioxide is taken out are very, very slow compared to the rate at which we're adding it to the atmosphere. Now, how do we know that 50 or 60-year record is unusual? Well, we don't have records before 1957, measurements, that is, with instruments, but what we do have are natural archives of the levels of carbon dioxide. And here we see an ice core that has been drilled through one of the big ice caps on the planet. In this case, Greenland, also Antarctica, is where we recover these ice cores. When snow accumulates on the top of these very, very cold ice sheets where it doesn't melt, as that snow accumulates and gets compressed by fresh snow, it gets compressed eventually into ice, and during that process, the gas in the atmosphere gets trapped in little bubbles inside the ice. So when we recover these ice cores, we drill down through the ice sheet, and as we drill down, we're basically going back in time. So if we take an ice core like this, we can sample the bubbles of gas, and we have a history of what the levels of carbon dioxide and other trace gases were in the atmosphere all the way back in time. And this is what it looks like for the last 1,000 years. So here we can see that going back 1000 AD, carbon dioxide was pretty much level. These are different sites where the ice cores were taken, so there's a little bit of variability. But you can see it stayed pretty steady around 280 parts per million. And then what happened? James Watt invented the steam piston engine in the 1780s, and the demand for coal began, and we started to burn fossil fuel. Then 100 years later, the internal combustion engine was invented, and that led to the demand for oil. And so collectively, we started to burn more and more fossil fuel, population increased, and we can see that the level of carbon dioxide started to go up. And here, right at the end here, is that 50 years of measurements that we had from Mauna Loa, Hawaii. And you can see that patches on perfectly with the long-term record that we have in the ice core. So the take-home message here is that for 1,000 years or so, carbon dioxide levels were pretty steady at 280 parts per million. And as the Industrial Revolution took hold, it's been going up and up, now almost vertically. This is an old graph. It's now a little bit over 410 or thereabouts, 410 parts per million, and rising very, very fast. Why do we care? Because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and what that means is it's transparent to energy that we receive from the sun, so-called shortwave radiation, but it's opaque to long-wave radiation, which is the energy that the Earth emits. So that energy comes into this from the sun, it heats the surface of the Earth, and then it's usually radiated away, and we have a balance. That's our temperature of the Earth is a result of that. But now we've put more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That balance has been upset, and the heat is being retained in the atmosphere, and the result is global warming. Now, where do these fossil fuels come from? Or you can see here this graph, I think starts at 1900. And originally, almost all of the fossil fuel we used was coal. And as we went through time, it started to be more and more of the fuel was oil and natural gas. Now it's about 50-50 on a global basis. Where did it come from? Here we see the different countries that are responsible for the global totals of greenhouse gas emissions. So we go back to the 1800s, and it was almost all a result of fossil fuel consumption in Europe, principally in the United Kingdom. Then as we go through time, we can see more and more the United States becomes a big player, and more recently, you can see China has started to become important, and these other countries. This gray area, you probably can't even see. This is all the other countries in the world. Africa, all the African countries, South American countries, Southeast Asian countries. So you can see on the big picture here, who's responsible for putting all that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. These are the cumulative emissions. It's quite obviously the industrialized countries of Europe, United States, and it's only lately that China and to some extent India and Russia have become players in this big picture. So when you hear people pointing to China and saying, China is responsible for the problems we have, think back to this picture. It's a little bit different story. So let's recap. Warming is not equally distributed across the globe. High latitudes have warmed more than most other areas. The land has been warming more than the oceans, actually, but the oceans are storing heat and expanding in volume. This warming is going to continue even if we turned off the CO2 spigot tomorrow. Most of the CO2 in the atmosphere has come from fossil fuel consumption in the major economies of North America, Europe, to some extent Japan, not China or India. And CO2 stays in the atmosphere for many centuries. So what are the environmental consequences of that so far? Well, we hear a lot about changes in the Arctic, and those indeed are changing rapidly. Here we can see maps of the amount of ice in the Arctic Ocean at the end of the summer. So this should be the minimum amount of ice after it's all melted. This is 1879, and you can see going forward, here's the situation in 2012. Now you can see that it's possible to take ships right through the Bering Strait around the ice into Europe, and China and other countries have been doing that in recent years. The whole ecology of the marine environment is changing, and that has implications for not just for the Arctic, but also for North Atlantic and for the Pacific, because those species will be moving around and migrating. And we can see here the volume of ice has been declining, not just the area, but also the thickness. Now, why do we care about this? Well, these two maps show this quite nicely. As the ice recedes, and the blue areas here show the more open water, that darker surface is able to absorb more of the incoming sunlight. So when it was bright and shiny, it reflected most of the energy coming into the Earth in polar latitudes. But as it gets darker, it absorbs more energy. And you can see this map on the right shows how much of that area that is ice-free now is absorbing more and more of the energy. And that simply accelerates the global warming. So this is a positive feedback. It adds to the whole process that's going on of the planet warming itself. We also see recession of glaciers. This is Glacier National Park. You can see these different dates. The glaciers have been getting smaller and smaller. And it's happening everywhere on the planet, even down at the equator. This is Cotopaxi in Ecuador, right on the equator. It's a volcano, obviously. It has glaciers and ice caps on it. That has been shrinking. This is the area in 1976 and 1997. And then we can see the area of ice has been getting smaller as we go forward in time. This is the situation in Bolivia. Since 1975, they've lost 50% of their snow and ice. Why do we care? It's Bolivia, it's Ecuador. Who cares about those countries? Well, this is what's happening. These are the glaciers outside of La Paz, Bolivia. From 1940, you can step through going in time. You can see they've almost disappeared. Why we care is this was the major water supply for the city of La Paz, the largest city in Bolivia. How much has Bolivia contributed to the greenhouse gas problem? Almost nothing. And this is the same throughout the poorest countries of the world. These countries are the countries that are being affected by global warming, and yet they're not contributing to the problem in the first place. The big industrial countries, as I showed you, are the ones that produce this problem. And yet the people who are suffering are the poor developing countries like Bolivia, like Ecuador, and many countries in Africa. And I was down working in Peru. A farmer came up to me talking about global warming, and he said to me, why are you doing this to me? And it was a very difficult conversation because he was asking me as somebody from the United States, why aren't you solving this problem? We can't fix it. We didn't create it. And yet we are the ones who are suffering from it. So I think this creates a very uneven playing field across the planet. And we have to recognize that the reputation of the developing countries, of the developed countries, is viewed in that light by the developing countries and the poor people of the world. Why should we also care about these glaciers melting? Because that water doesn't just disappear. It ends up in rivers, and those rivers end up in the ocean. And they contribute to the rise in sea level. And we can see here that sea level has been rising and accelerating. The rate of rise has been getting faster. And this is the projected change that we can expect over the next few decades. This is a very uncertain. We don't know exactly how global warming will develop, but the latest estimates are that somewhere between 1 foot and maybe 3.5 feet of sea level rise can be expected by the end of this century. And we're already seeing the results of that. This is in Miami, or Miami Beach. Now they're seeing more frequent so-called nuisance flooding when the tides are high. The water simply bubbles up through the drains and floods the roads, even without any sea level and any coastal storms. This is a nice sunny day, and they're getting this nuisance flooding. And we've seen it in other coastal cities too. This problem is only going to get worse. In Miami Beach, they've just spent, I think, $400 million trying to raise up these low-lying roads along the coast. Well, that's money that's not well invested, I would say, because they're just going to have to do it again before too long. And let's look a little closer to home. This is Boston. The orange areas on this map, you can see just at a glance, those are all within 2 feet of present sea level. So there's a lot of cities, not just Boston, but think about all the coastal cities around the world. New York, London, San Francisco, Buenos Aires, Tokyo. All the coastal cities around the world are going to have to face this problem. And of all the problems related to global warming, this one is not going away anytime soon. We've locked into this problem because the oceans are warmer and the glaciers are disappearing, and that water is going back into the oceans. So some cities have tried to get ahead of this game. This is London. They built the Thames Barrier across the River Thames. The City of London's up here. They've got these barriers that rise up when the tides are high, and it prevents the high water from entering the city. But they have to be open to allow shipping through. So it's a complicated engineering problem. And in today's dollars, this one defense costs $2 billion. So think about what that's going to cost on a global scale to solve the problem. Okay, we're getting to the end of the bad news, but it's not quite over yet. So here's the next question. Okay, sea level's getting higher, but what about storms? It's storms that really drive the water to the coast, and they can accelerate or exacerbate the problem of sea level rise. So the question is, will it be more storms or stronger storms related to hurricanes? And this is still a research question. But I like this study that was done. It seems to me quite simple. This was a study where they looked at the temperatures of the sea between Africa and the Caribbean, or Africa and Florida, which is where the hurricanes develop. And they simply divided it into years when the sea surface was relatively cool or cold, and years when it was warm. And then they mapped the tracks of hurricanes. And you can see quite clearly, here's the two. This is the East Coast, here's the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. These are the warm years. And you can see very clearly there were many more hurricanes and storms during the warm years than there were in the cold years. So I think as the sea surface temperatures rise in what we call the main development region between Africa and Florida, we're going to see more and more of these big storms. Whether or not they make landfall, there are going to be more and more of these hurricanes, and they're going to drive the seas into coastal regions. And what's the result of that? This is the consequence of Hurricane Katrina. These are refugees. These are people in the Superdome. They had nowhere to go. Thousands and thousands of people displaced from their homes. And then in 2017, we had 3 massive hurricanes in a row. In Houston, 60 inches of rain in 48 hours. It's unimaginable amount of rain. Why was that? Usually these storms stir up cold water and they kind of shut themselves off. But the water was so warm all the way to great depth that as the water was stirred up, it didn't cool off. It just stayed warm. And so more and more water was transported into the coastal regions, and it just dumped into Houston. $125 billion in damages. Hurricane Maria, within the same period, devastated many of the Caribbean islands. This is the British Virgin Islands. And not just infrastructure, but also agriculture. This is the Florida citrus groves from Hurricane Irma, completely waterlogged, and in many cases waterlogged with salt water, so that it wasn't anything that went away after the water receded. They had to deal with the salt in the soil. And lastly, this is a graph from Munich Re. These are the big insurance companies that insure the insurance companies. And you can see here the number of what they call relevant loss events has been increasing, mostly from hydrological and meteorological damages, flooding, strong winds, and property damage. And I was just reading this morning. In 2017, there was $340 billion in damage as a result of natural events. So these things are increasing in frequency, and it's going to cost us more and more going forward. For all of these reasons, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the sort of gold standard for this business, concluded in their last report, the warming of the climate system is unequivocal. No question it's happening. Many of the observed changes are unprecedented for decades or even millennia. The oceans and the atmosphere has warmed, the amount of snow and ice has diminished, sea level has risen, greenhouse gases have increased. Extremely likely that human influence is the dominant cause of this warming. And even the Defense Department, not Greenpeace here, climate change will affect the Department of Defense's ability to defend the nation and poses immediate risks to national security. Okay, we got to the end of the bad news. Are you okay with that? We have a good scientific understanding of these critical environmental problems. But there are solutions, and some actions are being taken. The problem is the politics of extremism have taken center stage. There's a vacuum of leadership at the political level in Congress, notwithstanding the congressman who's here, of course. But on the other side of the aisle, we have, I'll just give you a few examples and you can see the problem. Trump digs coal. He blames global warming is a fiction created by and for the Chinese in order to make manufacturing, U.S. manufacturing, non-competitive. So who does he appoint to his cabinet? Max Tillerson. Of course, he represented Exxon for many years. Rick Perry, he's still there, one of the few cabinet members who is still there, I think. But he says, I don't believe global emissions are the main driver. It's the control knob is the ocean and this environment that we live in. So go figure what that means, I'm not sure. The science is still out. This is a meme, this is a refrain you hear over and over. We just don't know enough. And then, of course, Trump appointed Scott Pruitt. I wouldn't agree CO2 is the primary contributor. The war on coal is over. Scientists continue to disagree about the degree of global warming and so on. Same sort of theme. Well, he didn't last very long, so who did they appoint in his place? Andrew Wheeler. He was a former aide to James Inhofe, a Republican senator from Oklahoma, former coal industry lobbyist. Who was Inhofe? Inhofe is the guy who wrote the book, The Greatest Hoax, How the Global Warming Conspiracy Threatens Your Future. He was in charge of a Senate committee that dealt with global warming that called for the indictment of 17 climate scientists for violating federal law. I was one of those 17, so I felt rather strongly about this. Thankfully, the Justice Department did not pursue that call. I wrote about this in my book, Global Warming and Political Intimidation. They tried to destroy our reputations. They tried to stop the science that we were doing, and it was a very difficult time for all the people involved. So there's been a well-funded campaign of lies and deception, largely on the right in the Congress. And the result of that is the public thinks that scientists don't have an idea of what's happening, that there is still a lot of uncertainty, which is completely untrue. As a result, many don't rate global warming as a major concern. There's little consensus on what to do about it, whether it should be carbon tax or whatever. And importantly, there are no costs linked to greenhouse gas pollution. Unlike any other pollution, it's not regulated. And the energy industries and their allies have a lock on the Congress. They've managed to push this to protect their interests. Okay. Whew. You're still with me. We made it to the good news part. Well, sort of good news. Not all good news, but a lot of it is good. So, a couple of years ago, the so-called COP21, the Climate Conference of the Parties in Paris, came to an international agreement to reduce emissions, to try to limit the warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 Fahrenheit, above the pre-industrial level. Now, bear in mind, we've already increased the temperatures by at least 1 degree, maybe a little more. So we're halfway there. But there was great enthusiasm, and it was a big achievement to get countries to sign up voluntarily and to create their own roadmap based on their own political and economic strategies, what they thought they could accomplish. It's a step. It's not an end product. It's a process towards reducing emissions to limit temperatures. The problem is, here's the 2 degrees target compared to the last 1,000 years. This is our hockey stick diagram, temperatures over the last 1,000 years. Here's where we are today. Here's where we're projected to go if we don't do anything about controlling greenhouse gases. So this is the target that they aim for. But if you read through what everybody is currently committed to, it doesn't reach that target. It's up here. So that's why I call it a step. It's a first step towards reaching that target, and it certainly has to be ratcheted down if we're going to meet that target. And of course, it doesn't help that President Trump has said that the U.S. will not participate in this process. Well, we'll see. We'll see that that is not quite the case anyway. So the good news is that even though the federal government has been somewhat impotent about taking the necessary measures, a lot is happening in other countries and a lot is happening in different states. Cities are taking action, businesses are acting, individuals are acting, and I'll show you some examples. Yesterday, Britain became the first major country in the G7 to set a net zero emissions target for 2050. So the idea is that they would try to balance the renewable energy they use with the renewable energy that they produce. And interestingly, for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, think about this, the first time, last month, Britain produced energy sufficient for its needs without burning coal. It's been burning coal for centuries. Other countries have stepped up, and the EU countries are being lobbied by several members in the EU to make this net zero commitment by 2050. So things are happening. And for those people who say, well, this is going to kill the economy, this is an example from Germany, going back to 1990. They have increased their gross domestic product by 50%, and they've reduced their greenhouse gas emissions by 30% or 35%. So just because you're reducing emissions, that does not have a negative impact on the economy. In fact, it probably has a positive impact. If we turn to the United States, many states are taking action, and the leaders in the United States are California and Massachusetts. California passed the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2016. Massachusetts did the same thing in 2008. And the goal of these bills is to reduce emissions by promoting more energy efficiency, developing renewables, encouraging other alternatives to fossil fuel combustion. This is the situation in California. This is their GDP since 2000. It's been rising steadily. Here's their greenhouse gas emissions, which have been falling. So you can grow the economy and reduce emissions. In fact, Jerry Brown, the governor of California, argued that the reason the economy in California has grown is because they've reduced emissions, because that has spurred innovation, it's spurred new technology, it's developed new industries. That's been good for the economy. It's the same thing for Massachusetts. I can't quite see the numbers there, but this is the GDP for Massachusetts, for the state, and this is the greenhouse gas decline. I think that's 11% and 60%, back to 1990. So we can see the same picture in Germany, in California, Massachusetts. Reducing greenhouse gases and growing the economy are not contrary, they are complementary. Cities are taking action. Other good news. This is an example. Mayor Bloomberg started this global initiative with big cities around the world, bearing in mind that half the people of the world live in cities. So that's a great place to start if you want to try to reduce emissions. 27 cities saw their emissions peak and fall since then, all these cities that signed on to this. And the way they did it was by decarbonizing their electricity systems, turning electricity production from fossil fuels to renewables, optimizing energy use. That means reducing waste in buildings, making them more efficient, providing cleaner and affordable alternatives to cars, improving public transportation, and cutting waste as much as possible. Other good news, businesses are taking action. Just before the Paris Agreement, 50 major businesses representing $1.5 trillion in revenue signed a letter calling for stronger action. 30 of these signatories have already reduced emissions by 9%, equivalent to taking 10 million cars off the road. Businesses can understand if you can reduce energy consumption, you're saving money. You're becoming more competitive. You can create new opportunities, new business opportunities. And so they're taking advantage of that. A leader in this has been Richard Branson, who has been challenging CEOs to think about ways of making money from this problem of global warming by inventing and developing new businesses. And finally, and most importantly, people are engaging, demanding action. And this has made a major difference, especially in the United States. And as a consequence, we have new Congress members like AOC. I love this picture. She's standing there talking, and all the older members, white members of Congress, are standing around listening to her. And she's telling them the way it should be. So hopefully we'll get her to come to Amherst in the fall, and we'll do this kind of thing again. And Ed Markey, too. So the Green New Deal is aspirational. It sets a challenge, I think. It's not legislation. But I think we are indeed on the verge of an energy revolution, and the Green New Deal represents many of the aspects that we see. This energy revolution is good for the environment, it's good for people, it's good for the economy, it's good for jobs. I'll give you some examples quickly. Solar installations have been rising, and the cost per kilowatt of production has been falling steadily. Projecting going forward in time, this graph just goes off into the future. Electric cars have been rising. There's a whole bunch of them parked outside here. And so this graph is in millions of gallons of gas that have been saved each year. And now it's something like 350 million gallons of gas that would have been otherwise used. So that's good news. But here's the bad news. That's only 0.25% of U.S. gasoline consumption. So it's rising. The use of electric cars is rising rapidly, but so is the use of big SUVs and trucks. So we're not really catching up to that trend. But don't be discouraged. Change can happen very, very quickly. And I'll give you this example here. This is 1900. This is Fifth Avenue in New York. Every one of these vehicles here is a horse-drawn wagon, except for this one car, this one vehicle, which is an internal combustion engine. 13 years later, every one of those vehicles is a car. There are no horses and carts. It happened in just about a decade. So imagine our energy future in a decade. And here's some recent headlines that tell you where this is going. Every one of these big companies is turning its fleet into electric. There are some car companies that have decided that within 20 years, they won't make internal combustion engines anymore. So this is the way it's going, and I think the energy system will be transformed dramatically in a very short period of time. And lastly, let me tell you where I think the biggest changes are going to be, and that is in wind energy production, offshore. And you only have to travel in Europe to see where the future is here. There are enormous economic opportunities in the United States for wind power that haven't even been touched so far. Just an example, this is Vineyard Wind down here south of Martha's Vineyard. This is a single company. 800 megawatt of offshore wind is being developed, enough to power 400,000 homes. It'll be operational by 2021. It'll make Massachusetts the center of the offshore wind industry. 2,000 jobs, making salaries of $80,000 or more, compared to much lower rates in the state. And here's the beautiful irony. Here's this former coal power plant in Somerset, Mass. that has been transformed into a renewable energy center by these companies. They've invested $650 million so far to serve the offshore wind industry with a big inverter and with battery storage capacity. This is happening right here in Massachusetts. They had lease sales for other areas of Massachusetts. The leases made $405 million, 10 times what they made just 2 years ago. By 2030, that's just a decade from now, there'll be 18 gigawatts of offshore power, but just 7 companies, 7 offshore wind farms in the Northeast. And new projects have been proposed all the way up and down the West Coast and the East Coast too, even in the Great Lakes. $70 billion is expected to be spent on offshore wind in the next 10 years. This is an enormous industry, and it's not just putting up windmills, it's servicing those windmills, building new ships. These companies are building ships that have very low vibration motors so they won't disturb the marine mammals. It's very regulated. It has lots of jobs, not just in servicing and building the windmills, but in also bringing the energy ashore. So I'm quite convinced that this is going to be a massive energy revolution for the United States, and it's going to be good all around for everybody. So how can we all help? How can we add to this good news? Here's my formula for that. We have to vote. Vote, vote, vote. What Billy Bulger used to say, vote early and vote often. But when I say vote, I don't just mean at the presidential level, at the congressional level, I mean at every level. Local government, school boards, stockholder meetings. Vote, use your democratic rights to make changes happen, because that's what is the most important thing. And then after that, of course, we can make our own changes to the extent that we can within our economic capacity, reduce energy use. The simplest thing is to eliminate as much as possible the waste. We waste an enormous amount of energy. Insulate our homes, try to reduce our carbon footprint in that way. If we can, invest in renewable energy in some way, or if we have to replace our appliances, try to find the most energy efficient appliances and so on. If we can buy electric cars or hybrids, certainly do that. Buy our food locally. Let's not buy Fiji water at Whole Foods, which is being flown in from the South Pacific. If we can eat locally and perhaps eat less meat once or twice a week perhaps, or buy food meat that's grown on land that would otherwise be not used for anything else. And overall, try to reduce waste and recycle. So our overall challenge is to engage in the democratic process, to push the agenda that we all believe in, to confront our political leaders and demand that they address these problems. We see this happening every day on the news. We must engage in this process. We have to work together, and we have to do this not just for the United States, but for a more sustainable and more equitable global society. We live in a global world. It's increasingly interconnected, and we have to recognize that the actions we take here affect people all over the world. And finally, I would just remember what Martin Luther King said in his speech, so-called I Have a Dream speech. And he was talking, of course, about civil rights. But he said, we don't have time to waste. And he used this phrase, there's the fierce urgency of now. We have to act because things are changing very quickly. And it's our responsibility to take hold of that and embrace it and try to make the changes that we would like to see in our environment. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.